science.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for, can you hear me okay? Okay. No? Do I need? I could do this, I guess. Okay. Airplane seats and microphones, that's the problem with being tall. Okay, well, thanks for having me. My name is Mike Brady. This is a co-presentation with myself and Tim Nedro, who, quick word on Tim. He's a PhD student, also though has a permanent position in our department, just hired in. And that position really has to do with being a specialist in doing economic impact analysis. And actually, Muhammad's, the end of his slide there is a good lead off where he had impact analysis. And actually in that case, we're looking at really the something a little bit different than in this case. And since I figured we wouldn't have, maybe economists would be a minority in the room, I just wanted to cover exactly what we're talking about with an economic impact analysis. And that's where you get into the issue of multipliers, which I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of, even if you're not economists. So if you have a dollar change in an industry, you get more than a dollar change in the overall economy because industries interact with each other. They buy intermediate goods from each other. So it's in the realm of the whole issue of multipliers. Just a little background too on this presentation, the way this came around. So I think it's probably fair to say most academic economists do impact analysis only if threatened with bodily harm or an increase in teaching load. And the reason for that is, if any of you followed sort of the sports literature, kind of the classic bad economic impact analysis is you add a sports team to a city and you count up all the dollars that people are going to spend going to those games, and you add a multiplier to those, and you count that as the benefits to the region, ignoring the fact that rather than going to that football game, people would have just gone to the movie theater, right? They would have engaged in some other form of entertainment. So it's actually no net addition to the region. That's kind of the classic, really bad study, and they're easily used politically. And so I think a lot of economists, and like a particularly academic economists, think it's sort of a no-win situation. But we work a lot with policymakers, and so this study actually came out of a meeting with Derek Sanderson, who was the head of the Office of Columbia River at the Department of Ecology, who's now the head of WSDA. And when it comes down to the policymakers, they just do need to account for the fact that when there is a drought, as skeptical as you want to be of, say, sports stadium effects, it is certainly the case that if there's less crop production, you are not hiring workers to harvest that crop, and they would have spent some of that income in the economy. So there's a sort of area in between there where that's certainly happening, and then the bad sports stadium study that you want to try to come to something realistic. The issue is always in the interpretation of the results and sort of the transparency of the results. I think the way Derek said it was, I see this number, it's $1 billion, that's the total impact, and I don't know where it comes from. And the issue with these tends to be that they're complicated to communicate. So what we tried to sit down and deal with here was what's the sort of, maybe thinking about the model design with actually the communication component actually affecting the model design, as opposed to what we do with science a lot, which is we develop a model based on the best science that we can, and then we try to worry about the communication after that. And in this case, with economic impact modeling, that maybe we needed to adjust the model structure explicitly to consider the communication and political component of talking about jobs, taxes, all that sort of stuff. So that's really where this came about. So this is essentially a good time for me to try out. It's kind of a change or a proposed sort of model structure and see how it comes across. So just a quick overview here, since I figured we wouldn't have that many economists, just basic input-output, that's I/O model concepts. Give a little bit of my argument for an aggregation scheme for an input-output model that's directly relevant to modeling drought impacts in agriculture. Then I'm going to walk through, try not to breathe on the microphone there, a specific scenario for the 2005 drought for a junior irrigation district. And then also issues with when is an input-output model not enough? So when you jump to something more complicated. Just a quick background on IO. So this is essentially it's a matrix. You've got you've got all of the industries in an economy. It's an N industries. So you have an N by N matrix. The row industries are selling intermediate goods to the column industries. Each industry is in both. And those flows, the numbers in each cell capture the interactions between industries. You have to choose some level of aggregation, obviously, and you can't go down to modeling each individual firm. So you have to aggregate to some extent. And you're tracking sales or purchases for an industry, interactions between them. And then you also have to characterize consumers, and the consumers are households, governments, and export. And then you have to make assumptions about industry expenses. So basically, what is the production function? What is spent on each good for a given industry? And how much of those goods are bought from within the region. If you're importing all of your raw goods from outside the region, obviously, then you lower the multiplier effect is the way it's put. So what's commonly used, so a lot of you maybe have heard of IMPLAN. RIMS-2 is the Bureau of Economic Analysis model. The OFM in Washington State, they have a model that's about 50 industries. IMPLAN and RIMS are in the 400 to 500 industry region. The issue then you can immediately see with transparency and results is that's a lot of assumptions or assumed values on production coefficients in a 500 by 500 matrix. So how do you communicate that? How do you show somebody, well, here my results are mainly sensitive to this one number in that sort of situation? So what about agriculture? The issue with those, even the 500 industry models, is they actually don't have enough disaggregation for agriculture. You have sort of a general specialty crop. If you're talking about irrigated agriculture, you get maybe 4 or 5 industries, and you really don't even have enough disaggregation for agriculture, even though you've got 500 industries. So you can't communicate it, but then you still don't have enough disaggregation within the industry you mainly want. So step back from this, what do we really need? Well, what we need is at least 6 or 7 industries. You have tree fruit, specialty crops like hops, mint, that sort of stuff, grapes. And then you get the grains, irrigated corn, wheat, alfalfa, and timothy would maybe be another industry. And then we just need to aggregate everything else, right? Manufacturing services. Just one manufacturing industry, one services industry. And so that's what we did. That's what Tim worked on. So, and we wanted to see how this worked and thought, so you just have 10 industries, right? So you can actually see the whole thing was sort of our thought. I may leave this slide here just in case anyone's interested. This whole issue of aggregation, there is sort of a theoretical literature going back to the specific issues, sort of the math of aggregation bias, and what happens when you aggregate the production of individual firms or multiple industries. So there is a literature on that, in case you're interested in. So what is the standard approach? Mainly because I'm going to propose a specific case where an alternative may actually be best for drought. So the standard approach is what you do is you call it shock final demand. So you change the final amount that's consumed for a particular good in your region. And then you've got different types of cuts called closure, just what numbers have to add up. The type 1 closure is where the change doesn't have households adjusting. And that's usually, if you want to communicate and talk about jobs or changes in business taxes, excise taxes, usually just want to do type 1 closure because you get those numbers directly. When you want the full induced effects are called, so people spend their income throughout the economy on services, then that's a type 2 closure. So households are actually changing their income, and then that changes their spending in the economy. So just some terminology in case you come across these studies later. An interesting case that came up this year is when shouldn't you do that? When shouldn't you shock final demand? So this year we had, at the same time we had a drought, we also had really, really low prices for timothy and alfalfa. I don't know if anyone's heard about this. Partially due to the dock closures, more production in Oregon. But we've got timothy and alfalfa prices are really, really low. So dairies are not producing less, right? So we don't have higher prices or less consumption of dairies. What's happened in this, the situation this leads you to consider is, what if there's plenty from outside of your region, if your region's the state? Well, if you've got something like dairies, they're just going to import more. You shouldn't actually shock final demand. You should have a change. It's called a regional purchase coefficient change. And I think that's a scenario that probably should be done quite a bit with drought impact modeling. and is not from what I know. So I think that's, you're actually essentially shocking trade flows, not final demand. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of the background. What about the major assumptions that we make? So how is that reduced water budget met? So lots of questions. Like a couple talks ago, drought's bad for the region, but sometimes good for science. So we're learning a lot from this last drought. So there is a coordinated effort as part of the Washington State Water Supply and Demand Forecast that WSU has with the Department of Ecology in Washington. And together with some other folks, we've really kind of rushed out there to find out everything that we can. And so we're looking at really mapping the changes in hydrology, in-stream flow rules, and curtailments. How does that actually play out? And we have a lot of questions. How much production does supplemental wells actually account for? California certainly learned that groundwater pumping affects agricultural production during droughts. They've now changed their groundwater law. But we don't know well enough about that. On-farm storage, we see a lot more ponds when you look at the remote sensing data, how much production is being maintained through on-farm storage. And what about trading? So between irrigation district, trading has to go through the Department of Ecology, but within districts doesn't. So we don't necessarily know how much one farm is leasing land from the other fallowing and then using the water on their farm. We don't have a complete record of that sort of data. And then a really important assumption is which crops are affected and how. And this gets down to there's really two important assumptions here. Does curtailment happen at the extensive or intensive margin of irrigation, as we call it? So extensive margin is you adjust the total irrigated acres. The intensive margin is you just adjust how intensively you're irrigating those acres. We don't know a lot about that, but we're learning a lot. It's important to recognize an assumption here. So, if we do sort of strict economic theory, you'd expect low-value crops to be curtailed first. But that makes an assumption about either you have a lot of trading or you have a lot of on-farm crop diversity, right? If a farm has all apples, what are they going to curtail if they can't lease with anybody else? So that's kind of the lower bound, is the assumption of you meet your reduced water budget by fallowing low-value crops and you work your way up the chain, right? The upper bound is that, well, say all farms, and the assumption here is that all farms have basically grow one crop and there's no trading. In that case, what you get is curtailment proportional to water allocation, right? So you just reduce all crops in proportion to their water use equally. And that'll give you a bigger drought impact estimate. So to what extent do each of those go on? Let me go back here real quick. So what we learned this year, you'd expect a lot of corn to be fallowed, but those corn growers have contracts with dairies. And so they can't. They can't lease their water to apple growers. And also issues like, I was going to replant my Red Delicious to Honeycrisp in 2 years, but hey, it's a drought this year. Why not put in that high density orchard now? So you actually may lose that apple for profit in the drought year, whereas we'd expect, which sort of goes against kind of a selective fallowing assumption. So that's really what we're learning a lot about this year through various data collection efforts. So like I mentioned, we developed that aggregated model, and here's what you get. I mean, the thing that's useful is you can see the whole thing, right? So here's all the flows that are in the model, and you can look at the whole thing. And so let me, the consumers there on the right. I didn't want to show you this, think you could track the whole thing, but you can talk somebody through it, as opposed to if you imagine that, but 500 by 500, right? So let's look at the Rosa. So we run through a scenario for the Rosa irrigation district. It showed the effect of varying that crop, the proportional curtailment versus selective fallowing assumption, and show how those results change. So Rosa's junior irrigation district in the Yakima Basin. The 2005 drought, main stem rights weren't affected, but the junior irrigation districts were. Their entitlement's 393,000 acre feet. They only use about 320,000 in a non-drought year due to changes in cropping patterns and better irrigation systems. So they kind of have to eat through about 82% of normal till a curtailment actually affects production. So at a 67% curtailment or 33% per rationing, they get 117,900 acre feet. That's the water allocation. Just to give you a sense, our apples use up a lot of them. And this is if you put it water in terms of water values by crop, in terms of dollars per acre foot. So if you run through these two different scenarios, you get estimated gross revenue in a non-drought year is 487 million, and this is all done through gross revenue because you need to track expenditures on production costs. So the selective fallowing, which is the lower bound, you get a change in gross revenue, total economic impact of, in terms of sales, of 550 million. If you vary that to then assume that all crops are curtailed in proportion to their water use without respect to their value, the number doubles. And our previous study on the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, this is really, within agriculture, this is the critical assumption, is there selective fallowing, lower value crops are curtailed first, or are there constraints, farm level crop diversity, lack of trading, that keep that from happening? And it's really identified as the major assumption that needs to be vetted, but I think we're going to be in a lot better shape as we collect information from the 2015 drought, as opposed to making really just a lot of guessing or presenting big bounds that everyone ignores and they just report the point estimate. Just to show you though, these numbers, I think how the transparency would hopefully work. This was a good exercise, and we thought, the multipliers seem a little high, and this was sort of Tim's opinion, and he's worked in the private sector doing impact studies for 10 years. He thought, the numbers seem a little high, but here's sort of the way the process goes, hopefully, is that, well, we think the numbers are a little high, so what do? You look at a table of multipliers, and since the model's small enough in terms of the aggregation of industries, you can actually look at all the multipliers. And so I pointed there specifically the services. Now, tree fruit industry is labor intensive. It's sort of like manufacturing in the 1940s. There's not a lot of mechanization, so you're hiring a lot of people. Half of variable costs are labor for harvesting the crop. So maybe the services estimate's not as big, but I think hopefully the goal with this setup, which I haven't seen quite used, of really disaggregating agriculture and then aggregating everything else, is that we can talk about specific numbers, do sensitivity analysis in a transparent way, and then produce a report that gets somewhere, as opposed to people sort of talking about a number and generically talking about it being too high or too low, but without specific questions. And I think I just said all that stuff. So real quick here though, on when isn't an IO model enough? You'd say, so a computable general equilibrium model, one of the main reasons to jump to that is IO models, prices are fixed. But actually with droughts, previous study by Eco Northwest within their 4 counts analysis, you don't see empirically, you can't find any price effects. USDA for California found pretty small price effects even after fairly severe droughts of a 5-year drought, only a 3 to 4% increase in prices. So that doesn't seem to be a big motivation or need to jump to a CGE model given the additional complication. We just don't see much price effects empirically. And then the other issue is if you do need a welfare analysis though, which is sort of a different ballgame, that is then where you need to jump to that CGE model. Okay, that's it.
Thanks. Time for questions?
Can you go back to the Rosa bar graph? That one. Is that other veg category, is that total for all acreage, or is that like per acre numbers?
It's dollars per acre foot.
Dollars per acre foot. So there's something that's not on that list that is the highest value crop? Something that's not.
Oh, no. So, sorry. So these we're sort of following the nomenclature of the Scott model that was used. So you're talking about things like onions.
Okay. big bar is like an other category, right? If you have some other high value crop that isn't the other category.
So if you just, as opposed to just calling it general vegetables, you could just call it non-potato vegetables. Yeah.
But that's a lot higher value per acre foot than, say, apples.
Yeah. I mean, this number is essentially the sort of rough approximation to this is if you take estimated profit per acre and divide it by acre feet per acre, you get dollars per acre foot, and that's the number you want to look at how water's allocated is in terms of dollars per acre foot. So and those numbers are from enterprise budget. So you get your profit per acre estimate from an enterprise budget, your water duty from either like the Washington Irrigation Guide or the VIC CropSys model. Process-based model, and you divide one by the other.
So it's profit, not say farm gate sales.
Yes, it's the additional benefit to the farmer from an additional unit of water. So you need a profit, not gross. Yeah.
So you also you're aggregating kind of everybody who grows hops or everybody who grows potatoes. So you're aggregating scale. You're aggregating big farmers and small farmers. So, I mean, is that effective? Small farmers would make different decisions than big farmers?
Well, so no. I mean, if you had say you did, and I've done this before. Say you had a potato industry, right? You would still be aggregating small and large farmers because you got small potato growers and large potato growers. So you could, as you break down by commodity, and so generally the distribution of farms within any commodity group is pretty much log normal. So for whatever the commodity group is, it's true for apples, cherries, potatoes. So if you disaggregate by commodity, you're still ignoring those economies of scale. You're not taking care of that by disaggregating down to a fine scale commodity. So the last question to break in the WSDA layer, there's 12 crop groups, but there's like 70 crop types, right? So say you wanted to go from 12 crop groups to actually modeling like 70 crop types and having an individual industry for each one of those. My guess is you'd still probably have a log normally distributed farm size within each one of those commodities. So I don't think by disaggregating to a finer scale commodity groups, you wouldn't necessarily address the economies of scale issue. So if we're not accounting for the
individual commodities that make up.
Yeah, so actually I would like to have disaggregated our agriculture sectors more. I'd rather get close to the 10 or 12 that essentially approximately match that WSDA layer. Now if you go back to this section, you look at the other vegetable, it's pretty small. So the way to think about this in terms of meeting your reduced budget is if you had like a step function where each one is, if you had water use on the x-axis and the height is the value per acre foot, and you sort of start from right and you order them from the lowest to the highest, you kind of get a step function that goes like that, and you just have to selective fallowing is you just start working from right to left. And so that other vegetable is really high, but it's at the very, very end, and it's the tiny little sliver in terms of acre feet.
I have a question. I mean, your talk title said 2005, and so is there enough data about what farmers actually did in 2005 in the Rosa District to compare with, say, a normal year and
Yeah.
see what is that sort of where you came up with the sort of 35 to 60% loss?
So there is definitely not enough data about what actually happened in 2005, and that's why what's happening in 2015 is so valuable. So, for example, the Perry Beal, who really does the WSDA data set, thank God for Perry, in early September he ran out and they resampled Kittitas Reclamation District, which is 100% junior, mainly Timothy and alfalfa. While you could still tell, he ran out in early September and resampled the whole thing this year. where it wasn't on schedule. It's a third of 33% of the state each year. So Perry went out and reground truth to combine that with remote sensing data to exactly how much was fallowed versus how much was likely deficit irrigated. The Rosa SVID Wapato irrigation project, those are on the schedule for this year. Luckily, actually, they just happened to be was on WSDA's data schedule for this year. So, and I think Mohammed, you had the one of the NDVI that Ming Liang put together, and so it's really combining all that of how much was, but the how much was fallowed versus how much was deficit irrigated is, I think, an important question. In addition to which crops, there was a group that went out with the Rose Irrigation District Manager Scott Ravel, and just to see what was going on, and it did seem like maybe some of the old apple orchards were just torn out. The high density, the newer apple orchards apparently look great, even in Rosa. Chad was on that.
Tearing out the beds and the
Yeah, so that's the thing. It's like you see this in when you model firm investment a lot. You see kind of a lumpy investment where it's basically maybe they were going to replace them in 2 or 3 years, but why not do it this year and to meet my curtailment? I'll tear out that old orchard. They probably wouldn't have otherwise, but they would have done it in 2 or 3 years.
Any more questions for Michael? All right, thanks.
Thanks.